Hello and welcome to Analytic Talk. I'm Anna. Let's start today's episode with a recent article by the Financial Times questioning whether China really ended extreme poverty. It has sparked a lot of debate about facts, about framing, and about how stories are told. But here is where it gets interesting. The author of another piece, Media Mythmaking, Mistake, Mischief, or Malevolence, Professor Robert Walker, was actually interviewed for that Financial Times article for about 90 minutes. But in the final piece, only a very small part of his views appeared. So the question is, was this skepticism or selective storytelling? Professor Walker took it a step further. He asked the AI tools to analyze the article, and what came out is something worth paying attention to. Five common techniques often used in Western media narratives. Let's break them down in plain terms. Number one, anecdote as evidence. You take one emotional story, one person, one village, and use it to question a nationwide policy affecting hundreds of millions. It's powerful, but it's not representative. Number two, selective geography. You focus on one of the poorest regions like Guizhou and subtly let the audience assume that's the whole country. It's not false, but it's definitely incomplete. Number three, moving the benchmark. First, you acknowledge China reduced extreme poverty, then you switch to a higher standard, like the World Bank's 8.3 US dollar line, to argue it's still failing. Same data, different framing, different conclusions. Number four, emotional anchoring. You open with a difficult, even shocking story, and that story shapes how the audience reads everything that follows, before any data even comes in. Number five, mixing unrelated issues. You connect poverty policy with things like COVID, property downturns, weak consumption in a short time span, even though they are not directly caused by poverty alleviation itself. So put all this together, and you don't necessarily get false information, but you get a particular narrative. Now, to be fair, Professor Walker is not saying China is perfect. He openly acknowledges the challenges, the complexity, and the ongoing risks. But his core point is simple. If you want to understand something as big as poverty reduction in China, you cannot rely on fragments of a story. You need the full picture and the full data. So here is the real question. What does Professor Walker actually think about China's poverty story beyond how it's portrayed? I'm very pleased to say I had the chance to speak with him directly, a professor emeritus at the University of Oxford and a recipient of the Member of the Order of the British Empire for his work on poverty and social policy. Let's hear from him. Professor, thank you so much for taking your time with us, especially you're still recovering, right? I hope you're feeling better and not in much discomfort.
Yes, I have my crutches. During your homework too, you obviously read quite a lot about what I've done, so that was very respectful. I appreciate that.
It's my pleasure to do all this homework and a great honor to speak with a distinguished experts like you in this field. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, especially about the financial article. China said it ended poverty, did it, has sparked quite a bit of criticism over its accuracy. And your article, Media Myth-making, Mistake, Mischief, or Malevolence, I think raises some very important questions, not just about perceptions of China, but about how we understand each other across cultures. So maybe let's start right here with your article. You argue that media narratives can distort reality. So, what concerned you the most about the specific Financial Times piece?
Well, I guess the fact that what you might call skeptical reasoning had been replaced by cynicism. So it was replacing an attempt to find out with an attempt to say and to tell a story that was perhaps pre written, pre-thought about. But to be honest, the first reaction was a surprise because I'd spent an hour and a half talking to the reporter, sharing with him my understanding of the approach to poverty alleviation, its complexities, its difficulties, the challenges, and the successes. And so when I read it, I was expecting something that would be nuanced, that would represent that complexity, the challenges which are really there. And I suppose I was, first of all, surprised, as you've pointed out, really, by the title, because it's a very subtle title. China says it eradicated poverty. It doesn't say that China did. It says it's suggesting, implying
Mhm.
that China is telling stories. So right from the beginning, the reader is set up with the expectation that there's something wrong here, and the article follows that through, and it starts with introducing us to an elderly lady from the Dong community who we're told lives on greens and cabbages, and that she spends something like 200 RMB, is it? A very small amount of money, less than $1 a day.
Mhm.
And we're then told that this demonstrates that China hasn't eradicated poverty. But we know very little about that woman, about her circumstances. We're told that she spends that much, but she could have large amounts of income, but chooses to only spend a small amount. So it just didn't feel real. And then I suppose I got quite cross when I found the sort of standard stereotypical easy sort of giveaway phrases like China's rubber stamp parliament, for example, that's referred to, without any understanding or explanation that yes, the parliament um, only meets for 2 weeks a year. But what it's actually doing is at the end of a process of consultation over at least a year, when pieces of legislation are discussed widely with 9 political parties, large amount of civil society engagement, we're not told that. We're using strap lines, which are not constructive, but are in a way derogatory. And so I ended up quite angry, to be honest.
Mhm. You try to brand China with negative terms with no explanation, especially the gap you mentioned between narrative and evidence. Professor, to delve into this, with a little help from AI, we see you identified 5 propaganda techniques from the Western reports about China. In your view, why such approaches are so commonly used in Western coverage of China?
It was quite fun using AI in that sense because I had already begun to think about, well, what is it that the author is doing, and why and how are they doing it? And then I thought of AI, and what that took away was the personality. So it wasn't me personally critiquing, it was actually looking at a broader view about what journalism does. And I guess there are a whole series of reasons, really. We have to think about the media in the West, which is competitive. Um, you you remain in business by writing stories that people read, and so you are attempting to capture interest in it. And what we know is that people like negative stories rather than positive stories, particularly, I think, in the West, we get used to that. And so there's a sense in which you are thinking about how am I going to maximize the amount of readership, because alongside readership comes income, comes in a sense. So there's a commercial interests, I think, are really there. I guess there's a sense perhaps of, dare I say, laziness in terms of not fully researching, um, telling what you want to do without challenging your thoughts, so that the story becomes more coherent, easier to sell, easier to tell. You know, lots of perhapses and buts get in the way of a good story. And so I think there's elements of that. I think I think difference, the fact that we assume that what we know is right, and when we come across difference, well, that's suspect. That's not like it should be. So there's an element of that. And I remember when I was when I was at Harvard 4 or 5 years ago, and looking at the way that international media had covered the COVID pandemic.
Mhm.
What one found there was that journalists who live in China were presenting a much more nuanced, positive story about the response to COVID than people who were in Washington or London as the editors, finally putting together the print for the following morning. In this case, the correspondent is actually based in China, so perhaps that's less of a reason in this case. And then I guess in a broader geopolitical situation, increasingly the world has come to recognize that China is a large player, and it's a large player that does things differently. This difference again, and if it's different, it's perhaps wrong. And we use words like adversary and even enemy, and
Mm.
so I guess that you are, as a journalist, writing within that context. And you can almost imagine that your audience expects negative stories because that's what the broader environment is telling them to expect. So it's pretty complicated, I think. But those are, I think, some of the reasons. Simplicity, possibly laziness, and this broader political context of competition.
Mhm. I think that brings us to a broader question about communication itself, because you mentioned that distortion works both ways, right? So, in an ideal world, how can both sides communicate more effectively? What would genuine cross-cultural communication actually look like to you?
To begin with, it's like friendship. What do we do as friends? We listen, we respect, we respond. And if one could take that little model and apply it more generally. So that means that we should be open-minded as we look at other societies. We should listen to what they're saying. This notion of respect that they have a legitimacy in their particular view and that we should acknowledge that legitimacy. Empathy, that we seek to understand where they're coming from and why they do that. Critical analysis, to understand more accurately, more precisely what it is they're trying to say, how they are thinking and how they are turning their thinking into words, recognizing that language constrains and shapes the way we think. And if we're thinking in different languages, we have to cross that bridge as well. So I also think, though, that we need to, as we think about going beyond understanding through to communication and partnership, we need to think about how the other person, the other country, the other culture views the world and change our way of telling stories into a situation which is more compatible with their way of thinking, not changing what we say, but certainly changing the way that we say it. So the sort of notion, for example, that we've already indicated that Western audiences are expecting negative stories, they're attracted to negative stories. If you look at Chinese media, you find virtually all stories are positive. They're about what we're doing, how we're being successful. Now, if we then start to tell that story to another world, it will look strange, it will look surprising, it will look unreal. And so I think we have to, therefore, if one was communicating China, to illustrate the challenges, the strengths, the weaknesses of what China, for example, is doing, not presenting purely positive stories. There's also the fact that the West typically distrusts government. If you think about the system, typically in a liberal democracy, you have parties competing. You have a party that's in government, you have an opposition. The opposition's job is to criticize government. And so there's a discourse about doing wrong as opposed to doing right. Um, the election cycles are quite short, so there's not much time that a government can achieve its goals because it gets replaced by the opposition afterwards who've convinced the people that government's not doing right. So there's a cynicism about government. Well, there isn't the same cynicism within in China. We're not used to thinking that politicians are government for their own sake or from a particular set of interests. We see government as operating on behalf of the people. So if we don't realize that cynicism about government or skepticism about government and speak as China would speak to its Chinese people, then those communications are not going to work. And the same goes in both directions, as you say, it's a reciprocal process. But understanding the other and speaking as the other would speak, I think is central to the process of communication. And what we're trying to do is build bridges and build friendships and build partnership and to be operate collectively as a global community rather than individuals competing for their own interests.
Professor, I couldn't agree more with different expectations from different audiences with different backgrounds. But a negative story is not necessarily untrue and partial, right?
Absolutely. Um, and when one engaged with artificial intelligence, it kept drawing attention to the fact that journalism isn't research. Um, that it journalism is often trying to put across a point of view, and therefore it is selective in its use of evidence. And if you choose to tell a negative story, you can put together negative evidence, which was essentially what was happening in that article. But it was worse than that, I think, because there was so much cynicism. It was very cleverly written as a piece of English, where it sets up negative expectations and then confirms them. So, you could have imagined the article beginning with China's contribution to global poverty eradication, whatever it is, 80% of the reduction in poverty globally over the last few years has been attributed to China. That story was told, but it was only told after we had been told that it wasn't true. We'd introduced to this elderly lady and not knowing her circumstances. And that shaped the whole article. That was one of the biases that the artificial intelligence came up with, a sort of I think they described it as an emotional negative anchor. It frames the whole article. That opening sentence, that opening paragraph sets up expectations. So again, as artificial intelligence said, it was an excellent piece of long form journalism.
Mhm.
It had a clear story. The fact that it bore relatively little connection with the real world was the criticism that you're essentially making. But it sold newspapers. In fact, to be honest, it's attracted this conversation. Um, but I just the reason I wrote it was I just felt that it was just so. I suppose to be honest, I was back to this point about disappointed that I had shared as much as I could about my understanding. And there was none of that reflected back in terms of the article. Not that what I said is right, but there was a big disconnect between my experience and what I was reading. And it struck me that it was worth thinking why it had been said in that particular way.
Mm. It was
And I
so.
don't really think it's necessarily entirely geopolitical. I don't think it was. It may have been, but I think a Western journalist, would write in that way for the reasons that I've already indicated, because people would read it. We have this sort of saying that no good news is news. It's
Mhm.
only bad news that makes news.
Mhm. Is selective and portrays an incomplete picture of the story. Professor, before we go deeper into this, I'm very curious about your personal journey because I know this is your eighth year in China. I understand you're currently in the UK, but may I ask if you're planning to return to Beijing at some point?
Yeah, I very much hope to be back in Beijing, the conference which I'm expecting to attend.
Oh, good to know. Then what led you to choose to work and live here? And What in China sparked your interest in cross-cultural understanding?
Well, luck at one level. When I retired from teaching here in Oxford, I didn't want to retire. I felt there was so much still to learn. I led a couple of research projects cross interdisciplinary and cross-cultural research projects, which included China. So I had some contacts in China, and I was invited to come. And yes, of course, I wanted to come because I still wanted to learn and wanted to teach. So that was the initial thing. Then COVID-19 came along. I originally came for just 2 years, the expectation of 2 years. But it was much safer to live in China at my age than to live in the UK. So I was rescued. I was given life by living in China. And so that was good. I've been surrounded by incredible generosity in terms of my colleagues and the people I've met who engage with me, who in some sense look after me, but provide this bridge into beginning to understand in Chinese culture and Chinese history, which is infinitely fascinating. I learn so much every day because so much of what is China is so different from what is the West and from what is British. So it's just incredibly exciting living in Beijing. And in terms of the cultural understanding, I guess it was the frustration of the gap between what I was being told China was like by BBC and Western media more broadly, and what I was experiencing in China. Now, I'm only one individual, a foreigner and an older foreigner, so my knowledge of China is very limited. But equally, I'm doing research in China on quite a large scale. And that was very different in terms of the story that we're told. So I was expecting this is slightly to exaggerate, but everybody in China to be fearful, everybody in China wanting to change the regime, everybody in China wanting to leave China. And that is just so ridiculous, just so far from the truth. Where life in China is broadly speaking positive, and that's one of the nice things about the culture. We have a problem that we can solve. We don't have a problem and then get frozen with the problem. There's the expectation long term that we're on a journey and that everybody is going on that same journey. So that's also positive, and again, something which is not necessarily reflected in the Western media. And then, to be honest, I was pretty horrified by some of Chinese communication
Mm.
because as I looked at it, I realized it would be ignored by people like me if I was back in London, that it would annoy me, that it would convey almost the impression of propaganda, which is a negative term in the West rather than in China, where there's much more information and propaganda are pretty much the same. So I was depressed and disappointed. And in a way, that goes back circular. I came with a negative view of China, but if the negative view of China came from the West and the way that China speaks to the West is not as successful, not as nuanced, um, not capable of telling the truth as it is, then that's a circular problem which breaks down this possibility of respect and empathy and understanding and working together. So it was those two elements really that got me thinking about, well, why should it be like this?
Mm.
And as we've already indicated, I don't think it's straightforward. I don't think it's just simple political rivalry. I think the challenges are much deeper than that, that we think in different ways. We necessarily think in different ways because the ways that our language is structured. And unless we are really conscious about that and think how we can use that knowledge to enhance our communicative skills, we're not going to get anywhere.
Yes, our culture and history made who we are, but the key is mutual respect, as you pointed out, especially for those who think or act differently. And yeah, there is a stronger tendency toward positive thinking in Chinese society and Chinese culture that rooted in our DNA to some point. And Professor, of course, poverty has been a central theme in your work. You've done extensive research on the dimensions of poverty, whether in the UK or in China. So could you briefly explain what those dimensions are and why they matter so much for policymaking?
Okay. Well, there's lots of ways of thinking about dimensions. So globally, we have what's called a multi-dimensional poverty index, which basically says income, health, and education we need to think about when we're measuring poverty. It's not really a measure of poverty, it's a measure of well-being or ill-being, but it's we call it a poverty measure. Think about China's approach to poverty too talks about two no wants and three no worries. The no wants, I think, is food and clothing, those very basic things. The worries relate to education and health and housing. So China thinks in a multidimensional way too. But I think the work that has most impressed me and has been most influential in terms of being picked up by the IMF and the World Bank is work that we did together with people experiencing poverty who were members of the research team, not people we studied, but were our colleagues in terms of understanding what poverty is like. And this was done in 6 different countries, as different as the United States, from Tanzania or from Bolivia. So very different countries, which came up with very much the same dimensions. And so sort of at the heart of poverty in terms of it being an experience is the word suffering. Um, Suffering in body, heart, and mind was what our colleagues insisted on us calling it. In China, when we repeated the exercise, they pulled out the physical suffering, the cold, the hardship, from the emotional suffering. But essentially, it's suffering in there as a heart. But it's not acceptance of that suffering. There's resistance. There's doing something about it in terms of the mother, in a sense, working hard to make ends meet. Also, occasionally, collectively, in terms of resisting that poverty too. But a wrapping around that suffering is the notion of being unable to change things, of disempowerment, that society is disempowering people who are poverty. So that's the core. But then there's the other things, the privations that we talk about more often, such as the lack of income or the lack of decent work, um, um, the material deprivation that we haven't got things that other people have, which are necessary in modern society. So those privations are there. So that makes 6 dimensions, and there are 3 more which are equally important. In fact, I would argue they're the most important of all. So one of those is the way is called social. They the way that our colleagues wanted to describe it was social maltreatment, treating people badly. That's society treating people badly. When we think about poverty, what do we think about? We think about laziness and we think about blaming. We don't recognize, importantly, the structural reasons that cause poverty. We think about how governments respond to poor people, to people who are experiencing poverty. There's no such thing as poor people. They are essentially good people. The English language is problematic there, so people experiencing poverty is a much better term. But societies typically treat individuals as numbers. They're on a list and that we're ticking them off, or they have to have a number before they can make a claim. So that's institutional maltreatment. And then there was this notion that that we, those who are not poor, don't recognize the contribution that people who are experiencing poverty are making. Then most of them are working. Most of them are working on low wages. They're contributing through that work to our well-being. So this notion of poverty at its heart being suffering and disempowerment. But who's doing the disempowering? It's you and me. It's those of us who are affluent. My wonderful life in Beijing is partly built upon the fact that there's large inequality still in China, and some of the wages that are paid in China are low for the productivity that's associated with them. And that's where common prosperity comes in, thinking about changing the income distribution from a pyramid into an olive, a recognition that those inequalities are there. So poverty is our responsibility, as well as being the problem that experienced by those who are currently in poverty. That's another thing. Poverty typically doesn't last indefinitely. People move in and out. It's a dynamic process.
Professor, another point I want to make is in your 2023 book, Poverty and the World Order. You take a rather cautious, some might say pessimistic view about ending extreme poverty globally by 2030. So, given all the technological progress and increasingly abundant material living standards we're seeing today, why do you think that goal is still so difficult to achieve?
You're right. I am pessimistic. One could start from an optimistic view, that we are probably the first generation in history that can solve global poverty instantly. The rich countries only need to contribute about 1% of their GDP, and we could eradicate extreme poverty globally. We have the resources. It's a question of what we do with those resources which gets in the way. And you're right, living standards have risen, and they have risen everywhere, but they have risen differentially. So if you think about the last 40 years, if you think about the income that the average person would have in, say, a rich country, that's increased by about $55 a day. In low income countries, it's increased by less than $5 a day. And in the most extremely poor countries, those countries which are of the most extreme, then income has risen by $2.5 a day. So you're talking about differences in getting wealth of factors of 10, factors of 20. So the wealth that the world is generating is deeply concentrated, highly concentrated in certain parts of the world. The there's SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that were introduced in 2015 are positive. They're saying that the world is coming together to achieve things by 2030. But they're also unfair in many ways. So we have set a standard of poverty that for low income countries that needs to be eradicated by 2030. It was originally 125 a day in terms of dollars. It's now, I think, $3 a day. But essentially, we're seeking to eradicate that. And in order to do that, in proportional terms, low income countries have to spend 6 times more the rich countries have to achieve in order to reach their goal, which is not a fixed standard, but a goal that rich countries choose, their national poverty standard. And they're not meant to necessarily to get rid of it, but merely to halve it. So the goals that we've set up are different goals, and they're structurally such that they disadvantage the poorest countries in the world. More broadly, the global structures of governance tend to favor rich countries. They were invented by rich countries, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, and they differentially benefit rich countries. So the terms of trade in terms of competition are loaded against the poorer countries. SDGs, again, are positive. SDG 17, I think, is about partnership. But whereas many of the social sustainable development goals have measurable outcomes, there's only one measurable outcome associated with partnership. And that's about devoting 0.7% of the gross national product of rich countries. And that was a goal that was set 50 years ago and has only been achieved by a handful of countries subsequently. So the notion of partnership needs to be made real. And in order to do that, we need to think about restructuring those institutions of governance, and China out a global governance initiative, which is actually putting on the table the prospect that those institutions don't work for the whole of humankind. They work differentially for those countries that 50, 60, 70 years ago were the most powerful countries in the world. And that's deeply problematic. So my skepticism, my disappointment really is that we're trying hard as a globe to really tackle problems together, but the structures that we have built make that very difficult to achieve.
I think that leads nicely into comparing different approaches among different nations. Because nowadays, when people think of China, they often picture its major cities first: Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, and China's fast development, artificial intelligence, new energy vehicles, deep seek those high-end products or technologies. But one thing we need to be aware when we talk about poverty reduction is that China is still not a developed country, and a major focus of government work each year is improving the well-being of the people, especially those in rural areas. It's true, there is a notable difference between China and the West in how policy goals are set. The Chinese government appears more inclined to set clear, specific targets, but the Financial Times article is quite skeptical of China's setting a clear deadline for eliminating absolute poverty. So, what's your take on this and the differences between China and the West when it comes to policy priorities and other areas where they can learn from each other?
An infinite number of areas in which we can learn from each other. We just have to step back, think about our own policies, think about the deficiencies of those, and look to others to fulfill, to overcome those problems. But it's again not quite as simple as that, as one would want it to be. Um, Rich countries address poverty in a different way because they define it differently. So China has focused, as you say, on extreme rural poverty. That's what China successfully eradicated in 2021. Extreme rural poverty. It was measured as a particular standard, which was about subsistence. Um, in most of the developed countries, we talk about relative poverty. We recognize that in our societies, virtually everybody is not at death's door, which is the subsistence definition of poverty, but then it's about being able to engage fully in the society in which people live. And so you have a measure of relative poverty. Now, absolute poverty, basic poverty that China has focused on, is well tackled by sustained and sustainable development, which is the route that China has gone. Tackling relative poverty is less about increasing the size of the cake, although that's partly it, but it's how that cake is divided. So when you're thinking about relative poverty, you are necessarily thinking about redistributing resources in society. So you tackle it in different ways and you have different problems. You also have constraints in terms of a difference in government. So China works as a consultative democracy, so that in a sense, everybody buys up to the same goals, signs up to the same goals, I mean, and that those goals are quite long term. So we have 5-year plans. We have the ability to build structural change with consistent goals. Again, in the West, that's much more difficult. We've already talked about changing governments. So long-term goal, long-term planning is much more difficult for those countries to achieve. But there are similarities. Um, China set a firm goal of eradication. Um, and I think in around 2015, when that was announced, I think we had something like 80 million people that we needed to lift out of poverty in China. Back in 2010, the European Union set a target for not eradicating poverty, partly because it was relative, but reducing poverty. And they set a goal for reducing poverty by 20 million people across the European Union by 2020. China succeeded. The European Union did not. China succeeded because of its ability to plan long term and because of the coherence uh, and and general support for a policy of eradicating poverty. In Europe, too many competing policy goals were in place to actually facilitate that change. And it's also China had a long-term strategy for eradicating poverty. We think of it in the last 10 years or so, but you have to go back to thinking about the first time an office, a national office was set up, which I think was about 1986, with a focus on tackling poverty. And you can go back to the Mao era, and many of us would argue that whatever the strengths and weaknesses of the Mao period, at the end of that time, what had happened was that you had improved the living standards of people in terms of their education and their health status. So when the economy was opened, they were able to take up those opportunities. So you can see that long-term nature of if essentially, to use the modern language, building common prosperity was in place over a much longer period of time. How Europe might learn from China, um, um, is to find ways of building long-term commitments to goals, um, and uh, that will be a challenge. But you also saw that alongside those goals that China came up with, you had top-level leadership. President Xi at one point was arguing he spent more time on poverty alleviation than anything else, which means leaders need to lead in terms of that. And the extent to which China was able to mobilize different elements of society, the private sector, the state-owned sector, working together, the rich cities of the East supporting poorer counties in the West are strategies which are rarely seen outside of China. They might be possible to implement them. But so there is a great deal of scope for learning, but we have to also recognize that poverty, when differently defined, leads to different policy solutions.
Professor, another specific debate raised in that Financial Times article is that using the World Bank's 8.3 US dollar a day benchmark to argue that China may be lagging behind in poverty reduction. But your data in your article suggests otherwise. In 2015, it says 42.4% of China's population was below that threshold, slightly above the 41.8% average for peers. But by 2022, the latest data are available, dropped to 21.5% of the population, far below the 35.8% average. So, what's really behind this number? Is this really about China um, underestimating poverty, as the article suggests, or is the 8.3 US dollar benchmark itself not the best comparison?
You uh, engage with a difficult set of numbers and a difficult set of challenges there. But the basic story is that however you pitch your line, China is doing well. And they're not my figures, they're the World Bank's figures that I was using in that analysis. So it's nothing new. But your $8.3 a day standard, that's what it is. It's a standard. It's an international standard. It's not a national goal. It's a means, a mechanism for for comparing the performance of different governments. I think what the author of the Financial Times did was to forget um, what China was doing. So China was focusing on eradicating extreme rural poverty using its national definition of poverty, which was considerably different from the $8.3 a day standard definition. And what I think the authors of the article forgot was that development and growth um, benefits everybody. So the focus on development as a way of eradicating poverty is also a focus on developing the whole society, everybody within that society. So that policy of promoting development and growth benefited everybody, and therefore everybody's income rose. And so whatever standard you pitch, lower or higher, China's income distribution was floating upwards. And it was floating upwards faster than other countries because China was growing faster than other countries.
Mhm.
So it was a confusion well, it was either a confusion in the minds of the authors or a deliberate attempt to tell a negative story. You can read it both ways, really. But because China was successful in terms of growing its economy, everybody benefited. There is still a lesson there, which says, when I first came to China, um, we were wondering what China would do when it eradicated poverty. What political language would it use? And there were a group of people arguing at that time that China should follow other countries and move towards a measure of relative poverty, which is really a measure of inequality in the distribution of income. It's looking at the bottom part of that income distribution. China didn't follow other countries. China kept its focus on basic rural income, but it's used other mechanisms. So it's thinking about its social assistance levels. Cities and provinces set basic floors that enable to, as it were, open the door to state resources. If your income is below a particular threshold, then you can access certain resources. So China is operating in that way. And we've also talked about this common prosperity, this notion of changing the income distribution, of building a bigger middle class. Those people who are on $8.3 a day and more would fit into that sort of category. But the message is there. It says, is the measure of the poverty, that is the language that China still uses in talking about poverty appropriate for a country that is moving from a transition from being an upper middle income country into a high income country? Should we be thinking about those measures of those thresholds which enable people to have access to resources? Should we think about them for the whole country rather than just thinking about different levels for different provinces and for different cities? If you think about for the whole country, that means you have to work exceptionally hard in the lower income areas of China in terms of boosting incomes. But it builds a sense of common nationality, which is one of the reasons that other countries have chosen to go for the relative income standard. So there are choices that China still faces, which you can read from that Financial Times article. Forget the negativity, forget the story that it's told, but there are the issues about where does China go in future and how does China talk about disadvantage in future? Because there will always be disadvantage. Uh, it's common prosperity is a good life for everybody, but it's unlikely that everybody's good life will be equally good.
Professor, earlier you mentioned poverty is not fixed, it's dynamic. But the Financial Times article also claims China's poverty standard is static. So, based on your research, how does China actually identify and update who counts as per in practice? And we talked about China's next 5-year plan and its long-term mechanism to prevent people from falling back into poverty. But do you think that addresses the criticism that China overlooks relapse risks?
It was a very difficult comment to interpret, really, from that article. I'm not quite sure what he was talking about. He was citing somebody else, which probably implies that he didn't necessarily understand what the other person was saying. So I think he was really focused on um, the targeted poverty alleviation strategy. China was pretty unique in terms of what was it, 20, shows how old I am. In 2013, 14 or so, China compiled a list of everybody who was poor, which is an incredible achievement. Some people say, I think it took a million or more civil servants to actually identify people in that list. And I think they were talking about the extent to which that list was updated, or whether people were ticked off, and once they left the list, they were considered to be no longer poor, even if their circumstances changed negatively in future. I think that's what they were talking about, and understanding that, and perhaps misunderstanding that. But you're very you're right in terms of pointing out that China is very clear in its understanding that poverty is dynamic. You see that in the new 15-year plan, in the 15th five-year plan,
Mhm.
uh, a recognition that you want to prevent people falling back into poverty. And that, and there's a number of ways of thinking about that. You can think about it as at a group level and at an individual level. Uh, our day-to-day circumstances as individuals fluctuate. You might be off work for a week, and that may have implications. You may have a new child, which is going to increase the amount of demands. So if you think about the balance of our income and our expenditure over time, they fluctuate wildly. And poverty is merely putting a line across those fluctuations. So some weeks you're out of poverty, some weeks you're in. And at that level is particularly important. But you can also think about it in terms of groups. So as we think about if you think about the transition from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy, which China is leading the world, then that process isn't going to involve structural changes. So people who are working in the coal mining industry, to take a simple example, over time, those numbers are going to be reduced inevitably as we move to cleaner fuels. So the question is, what about that as a group? How does society protect that group? How does society retrain that group and support that group to prevent them currently not in poverty, falling into poverty in future. So those are really important policy goals, which the 15 five-year plan talks about. And it's about just transition. As society changes, it has different implications for different social groups, and that we need to reflect on those and reflect on the implications of those too. There's also the sense in which, if you think about targets, and we were one of the in our earlier conversation, we saw that China had its target to eradicate poverty, and Europe had its unsuccessful attempt at targeting poverty. Targets sometimes cause institutions to focus not on the problem, but on the target itself. And some of the um, causes of poverty in China were so profound that they required fundamental structural change, development, if you like, to put one simple word over a complicated process. And that takes time. If you have a fixed target in time, there are going to be circumstances in which it is probably impossible to attain that objective in time. It takes longer. And therefore you have probably set up a new business in a local area where you need to generate a market. That new business will provide employment for individuals. Uh, but it takes time for you to be able to sell the project. So you have to bridge that gap, which again takes you back to thinking about mechanisms for preventing people falling into poverty, or during that transition period to be held above the poverty line. Those are the sorts of things that we need to consider in terms of our dynamics. But they were wrong. China is very much aware that individual circumstances change incredibly rapidly.
Professor, some Western coverage also questions about whether relocation programs have delivered as promised. I think it's true. There have been real challenges, and the Financial Times piece highlights a couple of difficult cases which may well be genuine. But do those individual stories mean the policy as a whole has failed or fallen short?
No, I think individual cases are really useful in terms of thinking about ways to improve policy. But they certainly can't be seen as representative. They can't be seen as a way of evaluating poverty. So they have their function, but it's a very specific function, I think. I think the the issue of relocation is something which is profoundly important and reflects again China's uniqueness in terms of seeking to eradicate poverty. I believe it's the only country that has ever done that. Other countries have sought to alleviate, to reduce poverty, not to eradicate poverty. So that gave policymakers, provincial and locally, a real challenge. You are expected, society wants us to eradicate poverty. There's a sense in which the West might argue, because it doesn't believe in social development in the same way. It believes in creating opportunities, but not guarantees. So China thinks about guarantees, making sure that nobody is any longer poor. The West might think whether, or at least raise the issue about whether somebody has a right to be poor. In other words, think about the challenges that China faced that other countries haven't. Imagine there is a village on a mountaintop where the local level of productivity is inadequate to raise everybody's income about the poverty, above the poverty line. What do you do in that circumstance? In many situations, China built lifts and roads up to those communities. But there were certain situations where even China's technological ability could not reach those situations and lift the living standards. So in that sort of circumstance, the challenge that local officials had was to encourage people to move. And that took a great deal of careful politics and careful planning. And, you can imagine shepherds who've spent their life looking after sheep. The thought of moving to a city must be quite frightening. And so there would have been resistance to that. And these are challenges that other countries haven't faced. They would have left the village, not insisted that everybody benefited from this policy. And so when you move the community, then you obviously have to provide accommodation. And the accommodation I've seen is amazingly good in comparison to Western standards of public housing. And you have to provide employment, new forms of employment. And you have, once again, to bridge that gap, that transition from being a shepherd to being a worker within a more urban community. And those are real challenges, and they are challenges for individuals, and they're challenges for the policy community that is bringing that about. But the general outcome of that, leave aside the individual challenges which are real and the challenges that policymakers faced, which were real. The overall story is that a very substantial part of China's poverty alleviation, particularly in provinces such as Guizhou and Yunnan, have been that it is through that process of moving communities into situations where there is possible to build an economy that will lift people above poverty lines has been profoundly important in terms of enabling China to reach its target of eradicating rural poverty.
Professor, finally, one last question. Actually, we touched on this topic a bit earlier in our discussion. If a journalist genuinely wants to report on China's poverty reduction in a fair way, so how should they balance individual stories with a broader data?
Well, as I said earlier, the artificial intelligence was telling me that I should not equate journalism with research. Um, but I think that journalism needs to become more like research in order to fulfill your objective of telling a balanced story. So it would be interesting to think about other villages who are living alongside the villager that was focused on in that particular story. Was everybody living on greens? And was it a matter of choice? Was this a vegetarian as opposed to somebody who was a meat eater? So I think when you're doing research, you're trying to be representative. You're trying to tell the whole story. Um, it's quite difficult for journalists to tell a simple story in simple words in a short space of time. But I think if you set out with a different question, a question of not a question that I want to show this to be true, but looking at the evidence on the balance of probabilities, what is the story that is the most truthful one that I can tell? I think that's the advice that I would want to give to journalists who would say, oh, you're just a researcher. You write long articles that nobody reads. We need to communicate with real people.
Indeed. I think that's a really important point to end this topic. Thanks, Professor, and for sharing your insights with us. And it's been a truly thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you. You're very generous. I enjoyed the conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we wish you a smooth and speedy recovery.
Thank you. I shall be hopping back very quick, very soon.